Hey y'all, welcome to Parent Empowerment with Mandy Drogin. I'm Mandy. I'm just a mom sitting down with real Texans talking about what's going on in our schools. And today I am joined by my colleague, Kate Bierly, and we're going to talk a little bit about what's going on in higher education and how that is working its way down into our K through 12 system here in Texas. Kate, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So, what really got my attention recently was when you wrote an article called "Is SEL Actually DEI?" So really quick, can you explain to our viewers what SEL is, what the acronym stands for, and what DEI is, so that they have a framework of what we're going to talk about in this wild exchange?
Happy to. So SEL is social emotional learning, and DEI is diversity, equity, and inclusion. Okay. And SEL is a practice commonly practiced in our elementary classrooms, and it's framed around empathy, justice, all these flowery, nice language, or all these flowery words.
Yeah.
DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, that is not just in our K through 12 schools, but that's also in our higher ed institutions, and you're seeing that through hiring practices. Yes. But I laid this out in an article, and I had come to the conclusion that SEL had been captured by DEI simply through what they've been practicing, such as social justice ideology and the mindset of the oppressed versus the oppressor.
Yep. Thank you for explaining that. Something else that I want to explain for our viewers to know is that you have a master's degree in education, and it's not just any master's degree. It's not like from the University of Phoenix or even the University of Texas. You went to the elite of the elite, Stanford. That is seen as one of the premier institutions in the world, really.
Yeah.
And this is where you were taught, and this is how you were pushed through the master's program for education, was all focused around what you just talked about, SEL, social emotional learning, and that it has been captured by DEI.
That's correct.
Okay. And your required readings were creating equity warriors in the face of white fragility. You were white fragility. That's Robin DiAngelo. Anybody that's studied, how DEI has gotten in. Ibram X. Kendi, the anti-races, all of that nonsense. So let's go. You open your article and you talk about an experience where you are assaulted by a student, and you were told that it was a good thing by your supervisor. Tell our viewers what happened.
Yes. So this was actually kind of a crazy story that had happened in my field work. So while we were getting our master's, or while that program was happening, we were simultaneously earning our California multiple subjects teaching credential. Okay. So part of that, you are teaching in a public school classroom. And so I was in a 4th grade classroom. I was teaching a math lesson, and a boy became disruptive, and I decided to repeat my directions, and he was so upset that he got out of his chair and he tried to bite me. And I was a little thrown off by this because this is not my classroom. I don't really know what I'm able to do here. And so I decided to take that to my Stanford supervisor. So after I was done with the field work, go back to campus, and I brought this to my supervisor's attention. I was totally shaken up about it and laid out the whole situation. And to my surprise, she had said, Kate, I actually think it's really powerful that the boy did this. I was like, what? And she said that it's actually a really powerful act that he's able to do that because he feels safe enough to emotionally let that out on you. So that to me was totally backwards, and that kind of opened a new mindset to me that, wow, maybe I'm not being taught the right thing. Maybe there's something else going on here that I need to pay close attention to.
Yeah, that's crazy. And I hear this, I released a podcast recently with a teacher who then we followed up with an image of one of her colleagues with a big black eye. And we've seen poll after poll that teachers are not leaving the classrooms because of pay, contrary to what they would, some of the, what I would say, education establishment and cartel would tell you. They're leaving because of exactly what you're talking about right there. The violence, the inability to discipline, this idea that children can't be disciplined, which you also touched on in your article, where we saw it at the Texas House, this debate going on of whether or not children, 5, 6, 7, 8-year-olds, can be disciplined. So talk to us a little bit about what we're hearing. And unfortunately, this has become a political battle for a very bizarre reason. This idea that disciplining children, particularly children that are, Black, brown, or indigenous, I think is where you kind of the Stanford model that has permeated all of our colleges of education. If they are that, they can't be disciplined. And we saw that in the Obama administration when the Department of Education came down with all these restorative justice nonsense, which says you can't discipline children. Can you talk about what we've heard here in Texas, but also what's being taught at institutions all across our country?
Yes. So actually in Texas, a couple weeks back, we had the school discipline bill laid out on the House floor. And there was some opposition to the bill, and people had argued that it's not gracious to discipline 5, 6, 7-year-old kids because little kids do, quote, little kid things. Now, the author of the bill had discussed, actually, it's not gracious to not discipline your kids. You're teaching them lessons that you don't want them to grow up not having that. And so that also sparked some, questions that we were told to reflect on back in the Stanford teacher education program. And this is all up on the Stanford website, their curriculum. But as far as discipline goes, we had 3 guiding questions that we were supposed to keep in mind before we went to our field work. And especially if you are white, you need to understand the privilege you have before going into a classroom to see, does your white privilege affect the way that you are disciplining your kids? So I didn't really know what that meant, to be totally honest. That's the first time I've ever heard something like that. But I wrote about that in the article, and the 3 questions was, how does your power and privilege show up in the classroom? Do you and the materials you use uphold whiteness? So the books that you're using to teach them how to read, does that uphold your whiteness? And are you perpetuating single narratives when you grade or discipline students? And you don't have to dig deep to find this. This is what's all over their website, all over their curriculum. And I guess back to the SEL thing, I wrote that SEL wasn't just part of the curriculum. This is what teacher education programs are getting taught to teach.
Right.
So, yeah.
It's wild. So I want to talk to our viewers a little bit. If we go back, how is this happening and why is this happening? And why has this affected our pedagogy and curriculum and all of that, particularly here in Texas, but quite frankly, all across America, where we see kids in this generation that they've graduated really in the past decade, and they've become, I guess, so open-minded their brains have fallen out. That's you're an exception, and there's some good ones that every time I see, kids out there talking about really all of this, the white fragility or anti-racism, which if we go back to kind of the civil rights movement and the view of Dr. Martin Luther King, which was obviously to judge people by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. But how did this happen? Well, I think people need to understand that it's called The Long March Through the Institutions. It was by radical Marxists who took Karl Marx and his idea, as well as Antonio Gramsci, who really wanted to overthrow Western civilization, particularly America, and our freedom-loving capitalist way of life. And they said you have to go after the church and the family. And the best way to do that is, now that the revolution is not the industrial revolution occurred, but the revolution to take over, the communist revolution to take over capitalism isn't going to happen because the middle class is growing in America. They said, let's go into the institutions. Let's go take over the thought leaders, the Ivy League schools, particularly that in College of Medicine and College of Education. And that's why we've seen these huge radical shifts. Then in the 80s, that's where they really started going into the Fortune 500 companies. And we see all of this now. They started doing all this DEI training. And so all of these leaders, both in the business world and our academic world, and in the government institutions that we've been raised to respect have really been infiltrated over the past several decades with radicals that do align with the vision of Marx, and that everything should be filtered through this lens of identity politics, right? What your color is, what your sexuality is, what now they're trying to create this whole nonsense of gender fluidity and whatever. So I want people to understand that that's where this came from, and that's why they target the colleges of education, particularly those at Stanford, at Yale, at MIT, at all of those thought leaders, because that trickles down into state schools and other schools that are educating our teachers. So I want to make sure that people really, really get this is a highly coordinated and concerted effort to completely restructure what's going on in our classrooms. And you saw it. Okay, so you saw it, you talk about it in this article, and you caught the attention of some of your classmates.
Yes, I did.
Okay, let's hear a little bit about, so you released this article, which we will link to in the description of for this podcast, where that people can go and read all about what, they've been talking about are you participating in the single narratives for race and whatnot when you grade and discipline students. I mean, my gosh, that's nuts. What happened? What did your classmates think?
So shortly after that article was posted on the Canon, I got a text from one of my former progressive classmates.
Okay.
And this text was a little harsh, and she had said, I'm disappointed to hear what you would learn through the STEP program. And I think you need to take a long look in the mirror and see the ways that you've betrayed yourself as a woman, betrayed teachers with this piece, the program itself, and just to reflect on what I'm saying and what I'm putting out there.
Yeah.
And so at first I'm like, oh my goodness, I didn't realize this would actually make its way to her. And I don't even know necessarily how to respond now. I can choose to not respond, choose to try to defend myself, or I can choose to do a friendly goof on her. And so I decided to do that. Okay. And so I decided to say, thanks, it's great to hear from you. But I have a serious bone to pick with you. You referred to me as a woman. And obviously, it was over the top humor. Right. And I was expecting a friendly conversation to come out of it. And, to my surprise, she actually thought I was serious. She said, oh my goodness, I'm sorry. Last time we talked, you identified as a woman. And it was crazy. And what I learned there was actually something super profound, that why didn't this woman, or why didn't my former progressive classmate know that I was totally goofing on her? And I had come to the conclusion she's totally tone deaf to humor because she's tone deaf to the reality about human nature. Those who are totally steeped in the social justice ideology, they can't take the risk to be humorous with others because they're going to get canceled. Right. But they don't understand that humor because the truth about human nature is totally irrelevant. And so I decided to take that, and I wrote another op-ed about it. And I just had such a fun time doing it. And again, the point wasn't to goof on her or to make her feel some sort of way, but really to shed light on the issue that, there's truth at play here, and we're toying with it. And you did a great job. I did that. We will also link to that where that you share the exact exchange and the ridiculousness of her response. Bravo, well played on that. But really that insanity that again has permeated the younger generation, where that they would even entertain the idea of what you identify as. You are clearly a woman. Everything about you is very feminine. That she would even have this idea that somehow you could now not be a woman is totally absurd. Is this, I gotta ask, is she in a classroom? She is in a classroom.
She is in a classroom teaching children through this lens of the oppressed versus the oppressor. Exactly. And part of me is like, gosh, I can't even put her at fault or these other students at fault because we're being taught that through the most elite institution. Right. It was such an honor to be there and to be taught by these world-renowned professors, but they're teaching us this information, and it would be a disservice to not pass that down to future generations. So at a sense, I'm like, gosh, I don't know. It's an interesting position to be in. Do you think they were teaching you, or were they brainwashing you? Total brainwashing. Absolutely. And there was okay, here's another thing. They
pride themselves in our cohort being the most diverse cohort yet. We had a little celebration at the end of our first meeting because we're the most diverse cohort. Yet there was zero diversity of thought. Everyone thought the exact same thing, and there was no room for critical thinking or discussion. There was one way of thinking, and that was it.
And what was that way of thinking?
Social justice ideology, the different skin color you have. Before you step into a room, you have to acknowledge your skin color, and how that power that you have just by the color of your skin can spirit murder minorities. So you had to be an abolitionist teacher.
What? Hold on. You just said a whole lot of things there. Can spirit murder?
That's correct. And
is that like dead naming? Is that this
to
is
be
like,
honest, I
what
don't
you talk
really know
about? This is like double speak, right? Out of Orwell's 1984.
Yes.
I know you touched on this, and I'm going to tell you, but that's so what? Spirit murder?
Spirit murder. And that was a term commonly tossed around. And so, yeah, we were always conscious of what we had, what power we had, so much so that at the beginning of every class, we had to write a positionality statement. What is that, you might ask?
Yeah, I was going to say, what does that mean?
We had to write the privileges that we hold and, considering our other classmates, how we can take space and make space. And so if you're not actively dismantling those harmful stereotypes that you have, which is so crazy to even say that.
It is crazy. Yeah. Did they force you to say the harmful stereotypes that you had?
Absolutely. I mean, by nature of my skin color, I'm harmful. So are you.
Right.
And also talking about this, this is harmful. So I think a white male would probably be the most harmful on that scale, but there was none of them. There was one male.
There was one male.
But
there's one white male.
There's one
in the diverse.
Yep. Yeah. So yeah, it just goes to show you that there is a ton of brainwashing going on, and it's hard to kind of escape that because you totally feel alone in that, and there's no one else trying to expose it from the outside or from the inside out.
Right. Okay. That's sad.
Yeah.
So this is what your program was, 1 year or 2 years?
It was 1 year. Okay. I got a master's in elementary education, and then I got a second master's in education policy.
Okay. Wow, that's impressive. You're very smart. Okay. So let's talk a little bit. So across the country, scores are plummeting in our public education system. Texas is not doing well. We're in the bottom third, particularly for our low-income demographics. But about 50% of the kids in our classrooms cannot read on grade level.
Yeah.
This is massive problem because that percentage sounds awful. But when we put that into numbers, there are over 5.5 million children in public schools in Texas, which means that over 2.5 million kids right now in our classrooms cannot read on grade level.
Yeah.
We don't have a retention policy to hold them back if they can't read on grade level. And if you can't read on grade level by the completion of third grade, there's a 97% chance you will never, ever catch up. And so it is a huge crisis, a huge crisis of low expectations. And really, the crisis that I see is the failure in preparing children to reach their God-given potential. Every child has promise, and they have a purpose in this world, and they have potential, and we're failing to prepare them to set them off on that. And that is where what all of this is about when we're talking about it, dismantling what I would say an absolutely psychopathic system where everything is focused on the lens of oppressed versus oppressor. And it's a problem here in Texas as well.
Yeah.
Because if that's going on at the elite institution of Stanford, we know it's going on at the other elite Ivy League institutions. And again, that trickles into our education institutions where we're preparing the next generation of teachers to teach the next generation of Texans. And so I want to hear a little bit about, we talked a lot about kind of the focus being on SEL, which has been co-opted, if you will. Because when I thought of SEL, like growing up, it was what SEL? It was Mr. Rogers or Sesame Street, right? Teaching kids not to bite each other, teaching kids to interact, teaching kids to not focus on skin color or gender and focus on making friends and respecting people for who they are, not encouraging all the crazy wackadoo stuff that the far left progressives have boiled down human nature and, quite frankly, the souls too.
Yeah.
All of the souls that, that make us who we are, they're trying to make it that you are all about the color of your skin or how you, quote, identify, which is just insane. Okay. So you go into, after goofing on her, I want to touch on this a little bit, because for our watchers who have never read Orwell's dystopian novel, 1984,
yes.
If you read it now, and it seems, when we were growing up, it would have been something like, this can never happen. But it really is like we're living through this, where you just said they told you that you had to acknowledge publicly. Did you have to acknowledge publicly your privilege, or to the teacher, or how did you do it?
We did it through a 1-page writing assignment, which it would serve no purpose if just the teacher had access to all of that.
Okay.
Because then they would see how well, I don't know, we act according to our privilege. But that's something we openly talked about. We get put in small groups and talk about how can we, even as a teacher, when we go into our field work, what does this look like? What are the demographics of your students? We had to submit that information so they know how many are Hispanic, how many are Black, how many are white, how many are Asian. And so, it was public. The teacher only read our positionality statement.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. Because it does sound like something where they would make you come in and confess your
confess your sins.
Yes, confess your sins, confess how you're bad, so that they can then use it against you or against your family members. Wow, that is wild. Okay, so let's go to what we know actually benefits children, which is not all of this DEI nonsense. It's not teaching children that they are oppressed or that they are a victim, but rather it's teaching them that if they work hard, if they study, if they learn to read, that they can be anything that they want to be. And we can look throughout history and see great leaders from all walks of life, all backgrounds, all skin colors, all of that, and see that if you work hard and make good decisions, that you can have a very successful life. But that starts with kids being able to read, right?
Absolutely.
That should be, in my opinion, the focus, particularly of those first few years in school.
I completely agree.
By the 3rd grade, every child needs to be able to read on the 3rd grade level, which would be proficient at reading.
Yeah.
Obviously, vocabulary expand, but you should be able to read and sound out words and understand the phonemes that make up the English language. Where are you all taught this?
I regret to inform you, Mandy, that at our Stanford teacher education program, for our classes in literacy, we were not taught how to teach kids phonics, which is alarming. Now, that was up to the teacher that you were under during your field work. So however they decided to teach it, or whatever curriculum their school was under, was the framework in which you taught students to read. So depending upon if you were in 1st grade or 4th grade, whatever that teacher decided to teach, whether phonics was being heavily implemented in 1st grade or 4th grade, that's what you were given. But in our master's program, the main focus was on what types of books are you choosing, not how to make a student read or how to be the best teacher you possibly can to make students read. That was not the focus. It was...
So the how to read, it was what you were reading to them.
Exactly.
So can you dive into that a little bit more? Because this is a huge, huge problem. And I would say it's one of the main catalysts that really kicked off the parent empowerment movement, because parents did start seeing what teachers that were coming out of the college's education were bringing into their classrooms. In fact, just this week, I had a friend that told me about his 1st grader. His 1st grader here in Austin, Texas, the teacher, the 1st grade teacher, brought in the book, My Shadow is Purple. If you're not familiar with My Shadow is Purple, it's a transgender kind of book that is indoctrinating children.
Yeah.
Why are you having these discussions? This happens everywhere. So I want to hear why. Well, I also want to finish that. Not when it was raised to the principal, an apology was issued to the father that, and this is what it said: you should have been notified and given the opportunity to opt out of that book. That it was. It wasn't, oh my gosh, this teacher won't be in a first grade classroom, or oh my goodness, I told this teacher and every teacher we're not bringing these books into our elementary school.
Yeah.
No. It was, you will, in the future, you should have the opportunity to opt out.
Yeah, no, that's
so
alarming.
Explain to me how that goes into the books that you select to read.
Yes. No, I'm glad you brought that up. One of our seminars, it was just filled with children's books, and the person who had headed up this seminar was very proud of all these different books, which granted, some of them were great books, some of them very alarming books. However, we got to choose which ones we wanted to bring in to go read to our class when we did our field work. However, none of that time was taught anything about the science of reading, nothing with phonics. Actually, funny enough, the first time I've ever heard about the science of reading was one of my first couple weeks at Texas Public Policy Foundation. So a lot of the stuff I was completely blind to or unaware of. But also I want to touch on the point that you had mentioned about opting in. This was a big theme in California schools. It may still be in Texas as well, but this was a big theme specifically around the sex education. So during my field work in the 4th grade classroom, I had to teach sex ed, and this was not opt-in. And the way that a parent would essentially opt out of it was a slip given through their kids' folder that they would send home. So many of these kids don't even show their parents their folder. They have no idea what's going on.
Right.
And this sex ed was wild stuff that I didn't even know that was at play. And so I think that the concept of opt-in, opt-out, it's like, no, that's not the issue here. There's a way, like there's an underlying issue here that's at play that's very alarming.
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up. We actually, we're working and hope to see legislation passed here in Texas, but we just listened on the House floor to someone, a Democrat, on the floor, and she was arguing that children should be taught about masturbation.
Oh my God.
If a parent wants to have that conversation, fine, but also I don't think that teenagers need to be taught. Like,
absolutely.
I'm fairly certain that they've got it on their own as they have since the dawn of time. But Andrea was just sitting there watching. I thought, she did not say that.
Yeah.
But this has no business. And this is one of the problems that I see as a parent is they start out with this argument that it should be that this is sex ed, this is health science, whatever. And it ends up with books like Sold, which is absolute pornography about an Indian girl who was sold into sex trade. She was trafficked, and it goes into graphic detail. It is absolutely a pornographic book, or All Boys Are Not Blue, or genderqueer, all of this. So they start on this spectrum over here of, it's just health sciences. We need to teach our children about their bodies and what's happening. And then it goes into, and we're going to create graphic novels to show your children every sexual act, including rapes, that occur. And it really is a depraved mindset that has come from institutions that are saying we need to cover everything, like, because there are people that are arguing, well, there are children that have been raped. And yes, there are. And that is awful. And we need to be addressing that, in my opinion, far more seriously, but not exposing more children to it.
Yeah, and putting it in a cute little children's book, too.
Correct.
That doesn't make the issue any better or any more friendly.
No, it does not.
Yeah.
Okay, so go back to, so you were allowed to select the books. Was there guidance given? What kind of books were in there?
Gosh, there was a lot of books. I mean, any minority group you can think of, books about that and different traditions that they had.
Okay.
A big thing that actually just came to my mind was our family unit. We had to create a unit and choose books that would support that unit on what a family means. And obviously families can look, or they had had alluded to the different ways that families are and being sensitive to the different types of families that can be represented in the classroom that you teach. And so I had wrote a book about the family that I have. And honestly, I've been incredibly fortunate to have a two-parent household and parents who
have blonde hair and blue eyes.
Exactly. And
right.
Exactly.
Was that bad?
I wrote about that, and I got talked to by one of my supervisors and someone else, and it's like, okay, this is not being sensitive to other people who may have two moms in your class or two dads in your class. I'm like, okay, I'm sorry, but this is where I'm coming from, and this is also what I think makes a family unit. Like, this is a belief I have, and also the success of a kid too growing up. And so that one didn't go over too well. But yeah, no, the books, it would range from a bunch of different things, different traditions people have, different food, different cultures, but all of minorities. You would not see a book about someone who has white skin in there.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
What was one of the most alarming, you said either working groups or actually class discussions after you started kind of recognizing why are we being encouraged to view everything through this lens of oppressed versus oppressor? What was something that once you kind of realized, whoa, this is what's happening here?
Yeah.
What are some of the most alarming working groups or just your experiences where that you were preparing to go in the classroom? Because you weren't preparing to teach. Yeah. You were preparing to go into a classroom and it sounds like deal with a lot of behavioral problems that you're not allowed to actually address because then you, from a two-parent household white woman, that you would be seen as not able to discipline children and raise them up in the classroom so that they know how to behave properly in society and reach their full potential.
Yeah, I mean, the classroom at that point just became chaos. It became babysitting and not even, you can't use discipline in the classroom. And mind you, we would be graded on how well we would teach, which I think is a great measure to have, but I'd want to be graded on how well I can teach phonics or teach a kid how to read. Right. Meanwhile, I'm being graded on the type of book I chose to accurately represent the minorities in my classroom. So the grading was backwards. And so when I started to realize that, I think layers started to peel back as I was going back to classes each day at night. And something that I started to catch on to, which I know is not a Stanford only idea, but after we would have supervisory groups, there would be a second section of the night that only minorities would participate in, and this was our affinity groups. And so it would be those who were Latino or Latinx, that's what they called them. And then those who were
Is that still
Black.
A thing? I remember when that was
honestly,
a thing.
It changes every day. So
right,
I don't know.
That was the most nonsensical.
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
I know. And so different affinity groups, they would go and they would talk and how to support each other while being a minority. And so me and then I guess like two other people who were white, we just walk out. We're like, we don't belong here. And again, not to flip the narrative there, but I think going back to the original diversity, equity, and inclusion, what they want, or by those definitions, it should be inclusion. And now it's just segregation all over again. It's exclusion.
Yes.
And it doesn't make sense how, okay, now we have our own group time. You're not welcome in here. So it's just... It was crazy.
Well, you just said something that actually I think is really important for everyone to understand. We're not picking specifically on Stanford.
Yeah.
I mean, we're picking on them in the sense that they have allowed their college of education to become a joke, in my opinion, in the sense that you're not teaching children what they need to know so they can reach their full potential in life.
Yeah.
You are brainwashing them into seeing themselves as victims for one reason or another.
Yeah.
And to not be grateful for who they are and to grow into who they're meant to be.
Absolutely.
But it's not just Stanford. It is everywhere.
Yeah.
All of the colleges of education, and we can see it here. Representative Brian Harrison and several others are just... they are relentless in releasing all of this insane radical ideology that is somehow cloaked in empathy.
Yeah.
At Texas A&M, the University of Texas system, all of these different universities that are training our teachers to go into the classroom. Yeah. And that's why when I'm out talking about what is happening in our classrooms, we know I mean, there are so many different reports. So obviously just this week, the teacher reading the first graders in Austin ISD, My Shadow's Not Purple. But also the privilege walks that teachers were doing.
Yeah.
I know Hillary Hicklin's talked about the fact she was forced to do that at Baylor. We have high schoolers that have talked about that. They've been forced to do this. You know, if you're not familiar with that, you line up on the baseline of the football field or the basketball court, and you're told, if you have two parents at home, take 2 steps forward. If you have white skin, take 2 steps forward. If you have lived in a house and not an apartment, take 2 steps forward.
Yeah.
And you set up this mentality, this divisiveness.
Yeah.
That it does affect kids. It does set them up for failure.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
When you tell someone they're a victim long enough, they start to believe it.
100%. And it's totally anti-merit. It's not based off of how hard you work.
Right.
It is just based off of something you really can't control.
Correct. Which is exactly what that is what has made America great. It is merit.
Absolutely.
We have, watched people, we read. So my kids, we read every night, and there's a series called The Heroes of Liberty. And I cannot recommend it highly enough for parents that want their children to understand the greatness of America, how a country that is less than 250 years old became the most prosperous, became the most benevolent, became the leaders of the free world, saving the world from Nazism and communism multiple times over. And so one of my kids' favorite books in that series, you've got Alexander Hamilton and George Washington, but one of their favorites is Thomas Sowell, the famous economist. And they loved the story because it's really quite fascinating. A lot of people don't realize this. He dropped out of school before he finished school to go work. He came from poverty, and we're talking about North Carolina, where he had no running water, no electricity as he was growing up. And he dropped out of school. He went to work because he had a difference with his adopted mother, who was his aunt. But then he realized, he didn't want any help. He went back to school. He obviously became a world-renowned economist and a professor. He's been at Columbia and Cornell and all sorts of these schools. And that story of merit, of working hard. And I think the reverse, when we look at the abundance that we have in America and people, it's, there's so many people who have so much and they don't work hard. Yeah. And they don't take pride in what they have, or they don't know how blessed they are because they didn't work for it. And but that narrative that is being pushed into our kids' classrooms, particularly in the low income areas where you are a victim and you can't overcome this.
Absolutely. It's not what our future generations should be.
So what would you like to see? So I'm looking through all this. What would you like to see if you got to rewrite the curriculum at Stanford or at UT or at A&M or for schools that want to be leaders for their colleges of education, to prepare the greatest teachers to go out and serve students of every background? Yeah. What would you say they need to focus on?
Well, I can think of a couple things, but first, which I think is so important, is teaching teachers how to teach students phonics, how to read, how to be great teachers, not to dismantle their harmful stereotypes. I think that teaching teachers how to teach phonics would go a long way. I also think accurately teaching the history of America is super important, and not to shy away from that. I remember we would always refer to President Donald Trump as 45 because people didn't want to say his name out loud in class. And so I think being able to look and reflect upon how awesome our country is, and not to do a land acknowledgement before every class about stolen land, but no, praise God we're on this land. This is an incredible opportunity we have, and we wouldn't get this in any other country. So I think being able to have pride in being an American, teaching our future generations how great, like you said, this country is, and teaching them how to read. And then I guess also setting up ways for students to think critically, not to teach them, I guess, again, what to think, but teach them how to think. And Also, I guess another thing is school discipline. How do we effectively discipline our kids? How do we make the classroom a place where kids learn and they love to learn, not where they can go and be disruptive and do whatever they want, but have an orderly structure to where kids love to learn?
I think that is a great path. I am so impressed with all of your great work here at TPPF, and I know that you're going to continue to do really, really great things. And I hope that all of our viewers will listen to the message that you just delivered and join the battle both at the legislative level, but also at the schools to push back, to fight back against what is being pushed onto their children. Yeah. Before we wrap up, I would love for you to look in that camera right there. We're closing in on the end of session, and then we'll go into the interim and we'll be working on some new policies that we hope that our university system across our great state will implement. What would you like to say to the leaders of the state of what they can do to make Texas universities, and particularly the College of Education, the very best in the country where teachers want to come to learn, so that they're prepared to go out and serve our kids?
Well, the leaders of Texas, first, thank you for all the wonderful work that you're doing in fighting for so many Texans. I think in order to make our universities the greatest place in this nation, to get rid of DEI efforts, I think would go a long way, and doing anything to base our learning off of merit, not anything else that we can't control. But that's what makes our nation so great.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you so much for all of your great work. I encourage everyone to go and read. You've written a lot of great stuff. This is really one of my favorites. Great job on saying the quiet parts out loud. We need more young people like yourself to do that, to expose what's going on, particularly at these thought leader institutions, so that we can course correct where they have really been run off the rails. Thank you for joining us today on Parent Empowerment with Mandy Drogin. And now you have the power.